The day my daughter announced she was rescheduling my birthday because of other plans, I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore. They thought I would simply accept it, sit quietly at home, and swallow the hurt. But instead, I did something they never saw coming. This time, the celebration was mine, on my terms, without their conditions or their disregard. And believe me, it turned out to be the best birthday of my life. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Martha Harper, and I was 68 years old the spring I decided to plan my own birthday celebration. I had spent most of my life in Greenville, South Carolina, a quiet town with oak-lined streets and neighbors who still waved at each other from front porches. After retiring from a long career as a literature professor at the local community college, I found solace in small rituals: morning walks to the farmer's market, afternoons spent reading on the back porch, evenings filled with knitting or old jazz records. Turning 68 wasn't a milestone by anyone else's standards, but it mattered to me. It marked not just another year, but a survival, a triumph over the quieter griefs that life had handed me: losses of friends, the lonely shifts after retirement, the widening distance between me and my daughter, Lindsay. I didn't want anything grand, just a day surrounded by the people who had touched my life, who remembered me not for what I had done for them, but for who I was. In late February, I sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook and a steaming cup of tea. I made a list: names of friends, former colleagues, neighbors, even a few students who still sent me holiday cards. My handwriting was slow but deliberate, each letter pressed into the paper with the weight of hope. I mapped out a menu: simple, hearty dishes that reminded me of warm kitchens and easy laughter, finger foods, a big punch bowl, lemon bars from Mrs. Carden's Bakery. I pictured it all unfolding beneath the old oak tree in my backyard, its broad limbs just starting to bud with the early hints of spring. Lanterns would swing gently in the breeze. Tables would be set with mismatched linens and wildflowers plucked from my own garden. I would wear my navy blue dress with the tiny white polka dots, the one that always made me feel light, almost young. I called Lindsay that evening, my heart skipping a little with excitement. We hadn't been close the way some mothers and daughters were, but we were steady, or at least I thought we were. I told her about my plans, expecting maybe a chuckle, maybe a teasing comment about me making a fuss over a not-so-round birthday. Instead, she surprised me. She sounded warm. She said it was a lovely idea. She even offered to help with the guest list, maybe handle the RSVPs, maybe organize a few games or decorations. Her voice, usually clipped and rushed during our calls, softened into something that almost made me believe the years between us hadn't built quite so many walls after all. Over the next few weeks, preparations became the brightest part of my days. I picked out invitations, cream-colored cards with embossed gold edges. I bought new string lights and tested them across the back fence. I stood in the kitchen, humming old songs to myself as I baked test batches of cookies, adjusting the spice ratios to find the perfect taste. Lindsay promised she would come by and help set up the weekend before. I marked the calendar with bright red ink. Lindsay here, 11 a.m. Every small step carried the weight of anticipation. Folding napkins into neat triangles, stacking plates in careful towers, organizing silverware into old mason jars. I found myself smiling more often, laughing at the small absurdities: the way the dog chased the string lights as I tried to hang them, the way the grocery store clerk winked at my cart full of party supplies. At night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea cradled in my hands, looking out over the backyard. I imagined the laughter, the shared memories, the clinking of glasses and soft hum of conversation. I imagined Lindsay laughing with me, not as a daughter burdened by obligation, but as a woman who genuinely enjoyed her mother's company. I allowed myself to believe this birthday might be different, might be better, might be ours. Each invitation I mailed carried a little more of my heart. I wrote notes on the backs of the envelopes. Hope you can come. Or, it's been too long. Tiny offerings of connection sent out into the world. Little lanterns of hope. It wasn't just a party I was planning. It was a reaching out. It was a gathering up of the pieces of myself that had scattered over the years, a quiet declaration that I still mattered, that my story was still unfolding. And at the center of it all, I imagined Lindsay's face lighting up when she saw what I had created. I didn't know it then, but that expectation, that simple belief, would be the part of me that hurt the most when everything began to unravel. It was 2 days before my birthday when the phone rang. I was sitting at the kitchen table, carefully wrapping small bundles of silverware in colorful napkins, tying them with thin pieces of twine. The late afternoon sun poured through the window, casting long stripes of light across the table. I wiped my hands on my apron before picking up the receiver, smiling when I saw Lindsay's name flash across the screen. I answered with a cheerful hello, expecting to hear her excitement about the upcoming weekend, maybe a last-minute question about who was bringing what dish. Instead, there was a heavy pause on the line, and my smile faltered almost immediately. "Mom," she started, her voice tight, businesslike. "Listen, something's come up." I didn't say anything. I just listened, my fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "There's been a change of plans," she continued. "We're not going to be able to make it on Saturday. Actually, it's probably better if we just postpone the whole thing. Maybe do something smaller later, less fuss." Her words hit me one after another, like dull hammer blows I didn't know how to dodge. She spoke so casually, like she was canceling a dentist appointment or rescheduling a coffee date, not the birthday party I had spent weeks planning. I sat there, blinking at the wall across from me, the one where I had already hung a string of paper lanterns in anticipation. "I'm really sorry, Mom. It's just, things are busy right now. We've got a lot going on. You understand, right?" I cleared my throat, willing my voice to sound steady. "Of course," I said, my mouth forming the words almost automatically. "Of course, Lindsay." She let out a breath of relief, as if she had been holding it in. She said she would call me later in the week, maybe Sunday, to check in. She told me to have a good day and hung up before I could say anything more. The silence in the kitchen afterward was deafening. I sat there for a long time, staring at the napkin bundles scattered across the table, the strings of twine curled neatly around them, little packages of hope that now felt foolish and heavy. Slowly, I unwrapped one of them, letting the fork and knife clatter softly onto the table. The twine slipped through my fingers and onto the floor, where it lay like a discarded piece of something too fragile to bother saving. I got up, moved to the sink, and ran cold water over my hands, watching the water pool in my palms before slipping away. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was being silly, that birthdays were for children, not for women my age. I told myself that Lindsay had her own life, her own burdens, and I shouldn't add to them with my childish need for celebration. But no matter how many times I repeated those things, they didn't settle the ache in my chest. I walked through the house in slow circles, taking down the strings of lights I had so carefully tested, folding the tablecloths I had ironed only yesterday. Every touch, every movement felt like erasing myself a little more. In the living room, the invitation list sat on the coffee table. I picked it up, tracing my finger over the names. People who had already said yes, people who were looking forward to gathering under the oak tree, laughing and telling stories. I thought about calling them. I thought about telling them it was canceled, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. Instead, I sat back down at the kitchen table, wrapped my arms around myself, and let the evening creep in through the windows, pressing its cold fingers against the back of my neck. Outside, the world kept moving. The sun sank lower, the streetlights buzzed to life, neighbors went about their dinners and routines. Inside, the house felt smaller, quieter, as if it had curled inward to shield itself from the disappointment hanging in the air. I didn't light the candles that night. I didn't open the bottle of wine I had bought for a toast. I didn't even turn on the porch light. I simply sat there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the old floorboards, and the sound of my own breathing, which felt heavier than it had in years. I had thought the hardest part of getting older would be the body growing slower, the joints aching a little more, the eyesight blurring around the edges, but it wasn't. The hardest part was realizing that the people you loved could forget you were still here, still hoping, still waiting for them to remember, and that sometimes they didn't forget by accident. Sometimes it was a choice. The morning of my birthday arrived with a kind of silence that didn't feel like peace. It was the sort of stillness that presses against your skin and settles into your bones, not because the world is calm, but because it's missing something that should be there. I opened my eyes to the soft light coming in through the curtains and waited for the warmth of anticipation to follow, but it didn't. There were no early messages, no buzz of a phone on the nightstand, no scent of something baking in the oven from a surprise visitor. Just me, the ticking of the old clock in the hallway, and the sound of the wind brushing against the windows. I moved slowly that morning. I made my coffee the same way I did every day. 2 scoops, a pinch of cinnamon, no sugar. I sat in the same chair I always did, the one by the window that overlooked the yard, where I had imagined tables and laughter and glasses clinking just days earlier. The yard was empty now, clean and still, as if even the grass had forgotten there was something to celebrate. I sipped the coffee in silence. The cup felt too large in my hand. I kept expecting a noise, a knock, a voice calling from the porch, but none came. Around mid-morning, I walked through the house, room by room, as if I might find something to anchor the day. Some forgotten note or card, some hint that this was all just a mistake. But the rooms held nothing but their usual quiet routines. The dishes sat washed. The bed was made. The invitations that hadn't been mailed were stacked neatly by the door, their golden edges catching the light in a way that made my stomach twist. I had dressed up anyway. I wore the blue polka-dotted dress I'd chosen weeks ago, with pearl earrings and soft lipstick. The color Lindsay once said looked classic on me. I even pinned my hair up just so. I wanted to feel like myself, like the woman who still deserved to be seen. But as the hours passed, that sense of self began to dim. I took a short walk through the neighborhood, not because I wanted fresh air, but because I couldn't sit in that house any longer. I nodded to a neighbor or two, smiled at the mailman, waved at a teenager walking her dog. None of them knew it was my birthday. None of them had any reason to. It was strange being invisible on a day that was supposed to mean something. When I returned home, the answering machine light wasn't blinking. The mailbox held only junk: coupons, a flyer for pest control, a political ad. No envelope with a familiar return address. No card. I made myself a sandwich around noon and ate it at the kitchen counter. The bread tasted dry, the tomato slightly mealy. I didn't finish it. I wrapped the rest and slid it into the fridge, where it joined the cake I had baked the day before, vanilla with lemon frosting, untouched. I stood there for a long time, staring at the cake behind the glass door. I had planned to serve it on a porcelain stand with fresh raspberries and a little mint. Instead, it sat sealed in silence. I couldn't bring myself to open it. Not yet. The afternoon stretched out endlessly. I tried to read, but the words swam in front of my eyes. I tried to nap, but sleep wouldn't come. So I did what I always did when I didn't know what else to do. I cleaned. I wiped countertops that were already spotless. I dusted shelves that had been dusted yesterday. I swept the front porch and shook out the welcome mat. And when I was done, I stood in the middle of the living room and realized there was nothing left to tidy but the ache inside my chest. By sunset, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat out on the porch, wrapped in a shawl. The streetlights flickered on one by one. A few cars passed. Somewhere down the block, a wind chime danced in the breeze. I watched the sky darken to deep purple and thought about all the birthdays before, some joyful, some quiet, but none quite like this. This one was hollow, not because no one was there. I had been alone before, but never like this. This time I wasn't alone by chance. I was alone by decision. Someone I loved had looked at the calendar and chosen to erase me from it, and I didn't know how to feel anything but small. When I finally went back inside, the house welcomed me with its usual sighs and creaks. I turned off the lights one by one until only the lamp beside my bed remained. I sat down and looked at the phone. Still no messages. I didn't cry that night. Not really. A few tears came, but they weren't heavy. They slipped down quietly, like the kind that don't need permission or explanation. I washed my face, changed into my nightgown, and pulled the blanket up to my chin. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, wondering if anyone had remembered, even for a second, that it was my birthday. And if they had, why they didn't think I needed to know. The next morning, I woke up with that same heaviness still pressed across my chest, like an extra blanket I hadn't asked for. I moved through the kitchen without purpose, making coffee because it was habit, not because I wanted it. The house felt no different than the night before, quiet, orderly, untouched. But somewhere beneath that familiar surface, something had started to shift. I felt it in the way I held my cup, in the way I looked out the window and didn't feel the usual ache. Maybe it was the finality of the silence that had settled in. Maybe it was just the exhaustion of being sad. But as I watched a pair of birds flutter around the feeder outside, I felt a strange clarity begin to rise from the edges of my mind. I had spent weeks preparing for a celebration. I had carefully planned, poured myself into every small detail, stretched my heart around the hope that this birthday might be different. And then I had sat through the entire day pretending I wasn't hurt. But I was, and I was tired of pretending. By mid-morning, I had moved from my usual spot by the window to the dining table, where the guest list still sat, neatly folded, unmarked, waiting. I opened it slowly, running my fingers across the names. These were people I had known for decades. People who had danced at my wedding, helped me after George died, brought me soup when I had the flu. They had sent me cards, called me on holidays, asked about my garden. They hadn't disappeared. I had simply stopped asking. For years, I had convinced myself that it wasn't polite to need things, that birthdays after a certain age were private, quiet things, that waiting for someone else to make them special was asking too much. But as I sat at that table, still dressed in my robe and slippers, I realized how lonely that kind of thinking had made me, and I realized I didn't want to feel that way anymore. I stood up, walked to the kitchen drawer, and pulled out my address book. The pages were wrinkled and marked with decades of handwriting. Some names crossed out, some circled, some with notes like "Move to Charlotte" or "Grandkids now." I flipped through it slowly, my fingers shaking slightly, not from age, but from a strange thrill I hadn't felt in a long time. I picked up the phone. I called Susan first, my old neighbor from 2 blocks over. She answered on the second ring, and before I could talk myself out of it, I asked her if she had plans this weekend. When she said no, I invited her to a birthday brunch at my house on Sunday. "Just a few people. Nothing fancy," I said. She didn't hesitate. "I'll bring that peach cobbler you love," she said. I called Carol next, then Janet, then Ruth. I called Dan, who used to teach across the hall from me at the college. I even called my hairdresser, Nadine, who laughed and said she'd be there with bells on. Each conversation chipped away at the weight I had been carrying, not because they all said yes, but because I was finally saying yes to myself. By the time I finished making calls, my dining table was covered with sticky notes, scribbled lists, and the beginnings of something that resembled joy. I pulled open the back closet and found the paper lanterns I had packed away 2 days earlier. I took them out and laid them on the table. I opened the cupboard where I had stored the good dishes. I brought out the cake stand, still wrapped in bubble wrap. I placed it in the center of the table, like a crown waiting for its moment. There was no longer a question in my mind about what I was doing. I wasn't reviving the party I had once planned with Lindsay. I was creating something entirely new. This wasn't about making a point or proving anyone wrong. It was about reclaiming a space I had quietly surrendered, my right to celebrate, to be surrounded by warmth, to be acknowledged not as a footnote in someone else's life, but as the author of my own. I put on a sweater and walked into town, the spring breeze tugging at my sleeves. I picked up a bouquet of daffodils and tulips from the farmer's market. I stopped by the bakery and ordered a fresh cake, vanilla with lemon frosting and sugared berries on top. I told the young woman behind the counter that it was for a party. "A birthday?" she asked, smiling. "Yes," I said. "Mine." She paused, then smiled wider. "Well, happy birthday," she said. It was the first time anyone had said it out loud, and I realized it mattered more than I thought it would. That afternoon, I sat on the porch and watched the wind play in the trees, my notebook open beside me, my pen moving quickly as I wrote down ideas. Songs I wanted to play, stories I wanted to share, little favors I could hand out at the end of the brunch. I wasn't just planning a party anymore. I was building a moment of belonging. And the beautiful part was, I didn't need permission from anyone to do it. The house felt different once I decided to move forward with the celebration. It was as if the very walls had straightened their posture, as if the old wooden floors hummed with approval every time my feet moved across them. I no longer drifted aimlessly through the rooms, mourning the silence. I had purpose now. I had something to look forward to. I began with the tablecloths. I pulled the floral linens from the cedar chest in the hallway and laid them out across the long fold-out table I had set up in the backyard. The fabric was faded in places, but still lovely. The roses printed across it soft and welcoming. I shook each one gently in the wind, letting them flap like sails before pinning them down with smooth stones I'd gathered from the garden over the years. Next came the dishes. I had considered using paper plates, easier, simpler, but something inside me rejected that idea outright. I wanted real plates, the good ones, the ones I had kept packed away in a box marked Thanksgiving and hadn't touched in nearly a decade. I washed each one by hand, lined them carefully across the kitchen counter, and matched them with cloth napkins I folded into tidy rectangles. I moved through the house like someone preparing for something sacred. There was rhythm to it, something meditative in the repetition. Wipe, polish, arrange. I dusted off old photo frames and leaned them on a table near the entrance, letting my guests catch glimpses of the life I had lived. George in his uniform on our wedding day. Lindsay as a toddler in my lap with a frosting smeared grin. Me at 25 holding a stack of books with more hope than sense in my eyes. Music was next. I brought out my old radio, the one with the dials I loved to turn slowly. I found a station that played soft jazz and let it drift through the house as I worked, the notes curling around me like threads pulling me back to myself. When Billie Holiday came on, I stopped what I was doing, closed my eyes, and swayed a little in the kitchen, humming along as I stirred batter for scones. The guest list had grown slightly. Word traveled fast in a town like mine. I had called 10 people, but 15 had called back. Some offered to bring a dish. Others asked if they could help set up. A few simply said, "It's about time," and promised to be there with bells on. I scribbled names and notes in my notebook, circling dishes to prepare and errands to run. But unlike the plans I had made with Lindsay, these ones didn't feel fragile or theoretical. They felt real, solid. I set out folding chairs beneath the oak tree, brushing off pollen and spider webs with a towel slung over my shoulder. I strung the paper lanterns between branches, clipping them to old nails and hooks left over from past seasons. When the wind blew just right, they swayed gently, like they were nodding in approval. I imagined how the yard would look at twilight, soft light spilling across the grass, the buzz of laughter and stories rising under the branches. The cake was scheduled for pickup Saturday morning. I had ordered it with a touch of guilt, feeling like I was replacing the one I had baked myself. But this cake, 3 layers of lemon and vanilla with sugared violets, was not an apology to myself. It was a crown. It was the centerpiece of something reclaimed. Inside the house, I rearranged the furniture to make space for people to mingle. I moved the armchairs closer to the fireplace, fluffed the couch cushions, pulled out an extra bench from the garage. I placed little vases of daffodils on every flat surface, windowsills, coffee tables, the back of the toilet tank. I wanted the house to breathe life again. On Friday afternoon, I drove to the nursery and picked out a fresh rosemary plant to place on the kitchen windowsill. The woman at the counter complimented my earrings, and I told her without hesitation that I was throwing myself a birthday party. She smiled wide and said, "Good. You deserve one." That evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of sweet tea and a stack of index cards. I began writing out small memories, little notes to tuck inside each guest's napkin, an inside joke from the past, a shared moment, a quote I had always loved. They weren't elaborate, just small anchors, reminders of connection. I folded them carefully and slipped each into an envelope with their name written in gold pen. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, the air grew cooler, but I didn't go inside. I stayed on the porch, wrapped in a light shawl, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. I watched the lantern sway above the yard and felt something blooming in my chest that I hadn't felt in a very long time. Anticipation. This party wasn't just for the people who were coming. It was for me, for the woman who had always put others first, who had grown quiet out of politeness, who had waited too long for someone else to make her feel seen. This time I had done it for myself, and it felt, finally, like enough. The morning of the party arrived wrapped in golden light. Sun spilled across my bedroom floor like a quiet promise, And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of excitement that wasn't wrapped in obligation or someone else's expectations. I sat on the edge of my bed for a few moments, breathing it all in, the stillness, the anticipation, the simple awareness that this day belonged entirely to me. I took my time getting ready. I picked out the same blue dress with the tiny white polka dots, the one I'd intended to wear before everything fell apart. I slipped it over my shoulders like armor, like memory. I pinned my hair back, added a touch of blush to my cheeks, and wore my pearl earrings, the ones George had given me for our 10th anniversary. I looked at myself in the mirror and smiled, not because I looked younger or perfect, but because I looked like myself. By the time I stepped outside, the backyard was already beginning to hum with life. The chairs beneath the oak tree were neatly arranged, the paper lanterns above swayed gently in the breeze, and the scent of fresh flowers mixed with coffee and something sweet wafting from the kitchen window. I moved slowly through it all, soaking in the small details, the way the sunlight filtered through the branches, the soft crunch of grass beneath my shoes, the faint clatter of serving trays inside. The first guest arrived around 10. It was Susan, carrying her famous peach cobbler wrapped in a gingham towel. Her eyes lit up when she saw the setup, and she gave me a long hug without saying a word. Then came Janet with her homemade deviled eggs, followed closely by Dan with a bottle of red wine and a wide grin. Each arrival chipped away at the doubt I hadn't even realized I was still holding. Soon, the backyard was filled with the sound of laughter and soft conversation. Plates clinked, silverware chimed against ceramic, and stories flowed as freely as the lemonade. People wandered from group to group, sitting beneath the oak tree or leaning against the fence with drinks in hand. Some brought folding chairs, others sat on the grass with plates balanced on their knees. I moved from guest to guest, floating in a haze of warmth. I hugged old students, laughed with former colleagues, clinked glasses with neighbors I hadn't seen in months. Every person who looked me in the eye and said, "Happy birthday, Martha," stitched something back together in me that I hadn't known was torn. Someone put on a playlist, and gentle music trickled through the yard. Old jazz, a bit of Motown, soft folk tunes that made people tap their feet and sway unconsciously. I found myself humming along as I passed out napkins with handwritten notes inside. Watching their faces light up as they read was more satisfying than any gift I'd ever opened. At noon, I brought out the cake. It sat tall and proud on the porcelain stand, 3 layers high, dressed in sugared violets and lemon frosting. When I placed it on the center table, a spontaneous round of applause broke out, followed by laughter and calls for candles. I didn't expect it, but Ruth pulled a box from her purse. 68 slender white candles, all accounted for. We lit them together, and the wind held off just long enough for me to make a wish. I closed my eyes, not to beg for something missing, but to say thank you. Thank you for this moment, for these people, for the choice I made to not let someone else's neglect define my worth. After the cake was cut and plates passed around, people wandered the house, admiring the photographs and vases of flowers. They lingered near the piano, peeked into the sunroom, complimented the rosemary plant on the windowsill. They made themselves at home in a place that had long needed voices to echo through it again. I noticed something else, too, the way people looked at me, not with pity or politeness, but with real affection, real joy, as if they were remembering me not as someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's neighbor, but as Martha, a woman worth celebrating. As the afternoon wore on, chairs grew emptier and voices grew softer. Some guests stayed to help tidy up. Others left dishes with promises to collect them later. Hugs were longer now, full of warmth and lingering connection. I stood at the edge of the yard, waving as the last car pulled away. The grass pressed down in friendly circles where people had laughed and eaten and remembered how good it felt to be together. I didn't feel tired, only full, filled with something that had nothing to do with food or wine, but everything to do with being seen, being known, being appreciated. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the yard in gold and shadow, I walked slowly back toward the house. The lantern still swayed gently overhead. The dishes could wait until morning. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment, letting the silence settle in. But this silence wasn't empty. It was rich. It was earned. And for the first time in many birthdays, it wasn't lonely. It was mine. It was nearly dusk when I heard the knock on the front door. I had just finished stacking the last of the plates into the sink, my fingers still sticky with frosting. The hum of the party still lingered in the air, soft music playing from the radio, the faint perfume of trampled grass and lemon cake drifting through the open windows. I wasn't expecting anyone else. Most of the guests had already gone, and those who stayed had left their goodbyes out back. I dried my hands and walked slowly to the front of the house, curious but calm. When I opened the door, the smile on my face faded before it could fully form. Lindsay stood on the porch. Behind her was her husband, Greg, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. Lindsay wore that look she had mastered over the years, tight-lipped concern wrapped in practiced detachment, like she had rehearsed the moment in her head and still wasn't quite sure how to play it. Greg didn't meet my eyes. His gaze drifted to the lawn, to the lantern still swaying above the yard, to the plates left on the porch table. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Lindsay cleared her throat and gestured behind her, as if the silence required a backdrop. "We were in the neighborhood," she said, as though that explained everything. I stepped aside without a word and let them in. It felt strange, letting them cross the threshold now, after everything. They walked into the living room as if it still belonged to them, as if the air didn't still carry the warmth of laughter that had nothing to do with them. I followed slowly, feeling like a guest in my own home. Lindsay glanced around, her eyes settling on the vases of daffodils, the remnants of party streamers, the crumpled napkins. "You had people over," she said. I nodded once, calmly. "I did." She looked confused, or maybe just unprepared for that answer. I watched her scan the room again, trying to measure what she had missed. Greg stayed near the door, his arms crossed, his face stiff with something between discomfort and embarrassment. Lindsay sat down, smoothing her dress over her knees. "We didn't know," she said. "We didn't think you'd do something like this." She said it like it was a betrayal, like I had thrown a parade in secret. But there was no apology in her voice, just surprise, as if she had finally realized that I could make decisions without her approval. I offered them water. Not wine, not tea, just a glass of water, plain and cold, because that was what felt right. They accepted, awkwardly, holding the glasses like props in a conversation they hadn't rehearsed. Lindsay tried again. "I meant to call you that day. I did, but things got complicated." I didn't respond, not with anger, not with forgiveness. I simply listened. Her words floated in the air, flimsy and incomplete, and I let them hang there. Greg finally spoke. "This place looks nice," he said. "You really did all this yourself?" I nodded again. "Yes." He gave a small, slow exhale, as if trying to decide whether to be impressed or annoyed. He looked toward the back window, where a few paper lanterns still glowed in the last light of day. We didn't know it mattered this much to you. That was the part that stuck. That word, mattered. As if I were only allowed to care if they recognized the value of what I had lost, as if absence could be excused by ignorance. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't pull out old stories or reminders of what I'd done for them over the years. I didn't need to. Instead, I walked to the mantel and picked up the envelope I had prepared weeks ago, the same one I had written after the original party was canceled, the same one I hadn't been sure I would ever use. I held it in my hand for a moment, feeling its weight, and then I placed it gently on the coffee table in front of them. Neither of them reached for it. "What's this?" Lindsay asked. I didn't answer. They would read it eventually. And when they did, they would see the photographs I had chosen, the letter I had written in my own careful hand. They would read my thoughts, not as an accusation, but as a declaration, a reminder that I remembered everything, not out of spite, but out of clarity, because forgetting is a choice and remembering is a power. They stayed for only 20 more minutes, just long enough to sip their water, make a few more halting attempts at conversation, and realize the warmth they had expected wasn't there. Not because I had taken it away, but because they had left it unattended for too long. When they left, I walked them to the door and thanked them for stopping by. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, I let out a long breath, not of grief, but of relief. The room felt lighter again. The house returned to itself, and I returned to myself. They had come uninvited, but I had been prepared. The morning after the party and after the visit, I woke up early, long before the sun began to rise. The house was quiet, but not heavy. There was no sense of tension hiding in the corners, no echoes of disappointment hanging in the air. It was a stillness that felt earned, like the calm after a long storm finally passed. I made coffee without rushing. I let the kettle whistle, let the steam curl around my fingers as I poured the water. The scent filled the kitchen like a kind memory. I stood at the window as the light broke through the trees, watching the world shift from night to day. It was a small, ordinary moment, but it felt extraordinary to me. For so many years, I had lived with the quiet ache of being background noise in other people's lives. I had celebrated in whispers, grieved in silence, and waited, always waited, for someone else to notice that I was still here, still hoping for a sliver of recognition. But now, that ache was gone. Not because someone else had finally come through, but because I had stopped waiting. The day moved slowly. I took my time cleaning up the remnants of the party, the empty glasses on the porch, the folded chairs under the tree, the bits of ribbon scattered across the lawn. But instead of feeling like I was closing a chapter, it felt like I was opening something new. I found a rhythm in the tidying. I hummed as I worked. I talked to myself, even laughed a little as I remembered snippets of conversations from the day before. I found a paper note someone had left me tucked into a napkin. To the woman who reminded me what joy looks like. Thank you. I held it against my chest and let its truth settle into my bones. I drove into town that afternoon and stopped by the local bookstore. I had passed it dozens of times over the years and always told myself I'd visit one day. That day had come. I walked the aisles slowly, letting my fingers trail across the spines of books I'd never read. I picked one at random, then another, and by the time I left, I had a small stack tucked under my arm and a membership card in my wallet. From there, I walked to the community center and checked the board outside. There was a flyer for a beginner's watercolor class and another for a Thursday evening dance group. I tore off both tabs. I didn't know if I'd actually go, But the thought that I could, that I might, was more powerful than I expected. Back home, I opened the windows to let in the breeze and lit a candle on the kitchen table just because I liked the scent. I didn't wait for a guest or an occasion. I made a small dinner, poured a glass of wine, and sat outside to eat under the last of the swaying paper lanterns. I watched the sky turn dusky pink and listened to the birds quieting down for the night. Everything felt softer, but not smaller, more intentional, more mine. I thought about Lindsay and Greg. I thought about the envelope still sitting unopened in the guest bedroom drawer. I didn't regret giving it to them. Whether they read it or not no longer felt like a weight on my shoulders. I had said what I needed to say, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with truth. And I had done it not to hurt them, but to free myself. The difference was everything. As the sun disappeared and the first stars blinked into view, I let myself imagine what the next year might hold, not just in the way of resolutions or lists, but in quiet possibilities, weekend markets, Sunday walks, spontaneous visits from people who remembered because they wanted to, not because they had to. Maybe even someone new. A companion to share soup with on rainy days, or sit beside on the porch without needing to fill the silence. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid of the not knowing. I wasn't measuring my worth by someone else's schedule. I wasn't shrinking myself to fit into spaces that had no room for me. I was filling my own space now, entirely and unapologetically. I was 68 years old, and my life wasn't behind me. It was just beginning. The lanterns above me danced one last time in the wind before settling, and I smiled into the darkness, holding my cup of tea with steady hands. This was my new beginning, and I was ready for it.